So, I think we've all had enough of my face recently, so I thought I'd put together a tutorial video on how to shoot light trails. Light trails and night photography, light painting, all of these sorts of variations on a similar low light photography subject have been an interest of mine for about the last 15 years. I think a lot of it came when I was living in Scotland, and quite simply, there wasn't a lot of shooting to be done after dark, and it's dark for a lot of the year in Scotland. So I decided to take the camera out and started playing around with longer exposures at night, and then discovered the joys of actually painting with light. So I've been wanting to do a tutorial on this subject for a while, basically how to shoot light trails, how to be able to capture images at night, and filming it is probably the most challenging part of it because it's dark. So I decided to go out just as the sun had set and set myself up to be able to take some light trails just over the M3 near where I live. And so I'm going to show you how to shoot light trails. I hope you enjoy. So first, find yourself a location. I decided to pick a bridge over the motorway because it meant I could stay clear and safe in any traffic. It also means I won't be a nuisance to anyone else. I set the camera up on a tripod, which, besides the camera, is really the only essential bit of kit you'll need. I actually used the railing of this bridge to brace two of the legs, which meant I was able to get the tripod much closer to the edge of the bridge. This is a slightly risky endeavour, but so long as you make sure it's well balanced, it should be absolutely fine. You just want to make sure that when you frame your shot, you don't have any of the bridge railing in the image. Once we've set up, the first thing to do is take a straightforward shot of the light trails for about 15 seconds at an ISO of 100 and an aperture of f11. This gives us an image to work from. If it's too bright, lower the ISO if possible, or increase the aperture to reduce the light coming in. If it's too dark, raise the ISO and open the aperture wider. The slightly odd feature of shooting light trails is that in our normal exposure triangle, the balance between ISO, aperture and shutter speed all contribute to the brightness of the image. This doesn't quite work here. Because our cars are moving light sources, they move so quickly through the frame that our shutter speed makes far less difference to the exposure than ISO and our aperture. Hence why we adjust these first rather than the shutter speed. Let me just show you a quick example here. I have 5 exposures of different lengths, but using the same ISO and aperture. These 5 shots go from 15 seconds down to 2 seconds. And you can see that in each of these shots, the background, the road, the railings, they're all fairly evenly exposed. The biggest difference between them all is actually the length of the light trails left by the cars. And that is determined by your shutter speed, because it's simply how far the car has travelled while the shutter is open. Each of these creates an interesting effect, so it's just down to you as to which effect you want for your image. Once you've worked out your exposure, your aperture, your ISO, and how long you want the light trails to be, the next thing to think about is composition. We have 2 elements to our composition, particularly from a bridge above the road. We can vary the horizontal positioning, shooting from one side of the road, moving towards the other, and it will really depend what's in the composition that will lead that decision. In this example, we have very dark roadsides, which leads us to a symmetrical leading lines, vanishing point type composition. If we had, for example, a large road sign that was dominating one side, perhaps with a Welcome to England sign or Welcome to Scotland, then we could use that to create an extra element in our composition, which would make these sides feel less empty and then balance the composition. We can also vary our vertical angle to decide how much of the frame the road actually takes up. If you have an interesting sky, if you have stars, you have a sunset, then including the sky can create a very striking image. However, the main subject of the shot is the light trail, so you want to make sure that that actually takes up a suitable amount of the image, especially as a large portion of just plain dark sky. It's not that interesting. By now, we've decided on composition, we've checked the exposure, and we've decided how long you want to actually expose for to create the light trails. Check your image. Are you happy with it? Are there any elements in the exposure that are making the image look unbalanced? There are a couple of Photoshop options if we do want to take this further, but actually I often find that this is enough. First option is take 3 or 4 exposures and then use Photoshop to combine the elements. For example, here, in order to expose for the sky, the moon, the clouds, I've used a longer exposure. That means that the rear lights and the headlights were too bright, so I then took 3 further exposures to get the correct exposure for these. I then just used Photoshop and some very simple masking to combine them to be able to get the best exposure out of each for the 4 shots. I think you can see that it means that it's just a little bit more balanced. Secondly, you may need to use a slightly shorter exposure. When I first got to my location, there was still plenty of light in the sky from the just set sun, so the longest exposure that I could get without using a neutral density filter was about 3 or 4 seconds. This meant that all my trails were too short. So what I did was I took 30 pictures over the course of 2 or 3 minutes, and then put them all into Photoshop as layers and used the lighten blending mode. This meant the sky and the road were generally still at the correct exposure, but all of the trails combined, which meant that it looked like one long exposure. In some cases, it meant the highlights were slightly blown out, so in those cases I used masks to wipe those blown highlights out of the shot. So that's about it for shooting light trails. It's actually very simple and it's a lot of fun. You get to create interesting, creative, unusual images, and the more you play with it, the more you experiment, the more you will be able to create. Remember that you don't just have to shoot the light trails. Using a higher ISO and a wider aperture will allow you to freeze the motion of the cars, and the incredibly dramatic lighting from headlights will let you create some really sort of dramatic shots without needing motion in them. So thank you very much for watching. If you would like to see more how-to videos, please subscribe to the channel and check out my how-to playlist. If you like the video, please give it a like, and I'll try to do some more how-to videos on low light exposures and light painting when I work out how to film them slightly better. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.